There are mechanisms in the brain that seemingly are involved in religious experience. It doesn't discount the idea of God. There are just religious correlates, it seems. But fascinating that we have these brain regions. How about this, everybody? When Olaf Blank in Switzerland stimulated this woman, this is a case study, in 2002, the left angular gyrus just at the back of the brain here is stimulated, and she feels as though she's being copied, and their copy is pressing up against her on the operating table. Stimulate the right angular gyrus just on the other side, and she feels as though she's being pulled out of her body and is hovering in the air about 6 feet above her own body. So incredibly, you can produce out-of-body experiences. Now, this shouldn't come as a surprise, because drugs like cannabis, drugs like ketamine, drugs like, for example, heroin, can cause dissociation where you feel as though you're out of your body. And of course, with drugs like ketamine, this is one of the reasons why people use them. This is called K-holing. Not good. Ketamine, I don't advise you try it. It's usually used as a medical grade anesthetic, and it will cause, with repeated use, bladder scarring, and worst case scenario, not just psychiatric dysfunction, but bladder removal and an artificial bladder. And just for the males listening, this often coincides with an inability from that point onwards to ever achieve an erection again. So many reasons why this should be avoided, ketamine. All right under medical anesthesic conditions, but not necessarily self-administering. So we know that different regions of the brain are involved in different functions. We know that different regions of the brain, when stimulated, can actually produce experiences that may be consistent with psychiatric disturbances. So there is some theories that many disturbances of brain and psychiatric disturbances have actually parallels in brain stimulation, for example. You can see how these regions can be altered, producing similar behaviors. Of course, when we look at complex disorders like OCD, we are getting to grips with some quite complex theories now about what's actually happening inside the brain. Problems with the frontal lobe, problems with the region deeper down inside the brain called the basal ganglia, which is involved in habitual behavior. And we get abnormal neural pathways, abnormal relationships between these areas, so that your frontal lobes are less able to inhibit habitual behaviors that become established. Hand washing that you sometimes hear described in some forms of OCD. The person with the frontal lobe inhibition lost can't actually regulate the behavior that then takes over. So it's actually quite complex the way these disorders work. There are neurotransmitter implications as well. But we're now starting to make a lot of inroads into this. Using neuroimaging, which we never had access to, we can scan the brains of individuals with disorders. You know, this is, for example, a patient with schizophrenia in the brain scanner hearing the voices talking to them. Now, when I look at that scan, I would say, okay, if I didn't know that was a patient with schizophrenia, it's a male, because you tend to see unilateral hemispheric processing for language with men. And I would say that that person was listening to externally generated information in the scanner, perhaps through headphones. In other words, they were listening to a passage of text played whilst they were in the brain scanner. But I know that that is in fact an individual with schizophrenia who's listening to internally generated hallucinations inside the brain scanner. And what the scanner shows is the brain is not working properly, and the hallucinations produced by the brain are misinterpreted at a brain level as being external in nature. So in fact, there's a disorganization of brain, it appears, in auditory hallucinations in schizophrenia. And scanning the brain will actually show us that. And somebody's put that this is a symptom or a cause of schizophrenia. Very much it is the case that auditory hallucinations are actually symptoms of the schizophrenia. They don't lead to the further patterns. They are what we call positive symptoms, the additional behaviors that are part of the constellation of behaviors that we see with schizophrenia. And of course, as we know, we now learn more about genes and environment. We're starting to understand prenatal influences on schizophrenia, which I'm going to come to shortly, and in fact, a whole range of other mental disorders as well. A lot of atypical behaviors, abnormal behaviors, have their roots, according to some, in the womb. And we're starting to get into scary territory here, of course, because we're then starting to look at factors that are beyond your control, predispositions that come from, for example, being in the womb exposed to viruses through the mother, and a whole range of other agents that we don't have any control over. Okay, now it would be wrong of me to suggest that we are all clear and all in union in terms of our definitions of mental illness, because we're not. Even today, as the World Health Organization has stated, there is no single consensus on the definition of mental illness or mental disorder. The phrasing used depends on the social, the cultural, the economic, and even the legal context. I won't go into this in any detail because I'm aware of the fact that most of you will be quite aware of what's actually happening in terms of mental disorder as a general sort of definition. The definition the DSM-5, the American Psychiatric Association, use is a mental disorder is a syndrome characterized by clinically significant disturbance in an individual's cognition, emotion, regulation, or behavior that reflects a dysfunction in the psychological, biological, or developmental processes underlying mental functioning. In other words, why say something succinctly when you can throw the whole kitchen sink at it? And this is one of the criticisms of the DSM-5, that rather than being specific in terms of its diagnosis, its definition of mental illness, it's actually, what's the best way of putting this? It's actually encompassing all behaviours. It's all inclusive. Is there any such thing as normal behaviour? Prof. Kinderman at the University of Liverpool, not far away from me, wrote a damning article about the DSM-5, saying that the problem with it is that everybody is potentially diagnosable if we were to use the DSM-5 over here. Okay. Not everybody, of course, has been an advocate of the idea of mental illness. The famous psychiatrist Thomas Szasz, the Hungarian psychiatrist, wrote, "If you talk to God, you're praying. If God talks to you, you have schizophrenia." And you'd be saying that this is nonsense. We're in the 20th century, and yet we suggest that if somebody hears God talking back to them when they're praying, that they have some kind of mental illness. And Szasz was saying, why should we not expect people to hear God talking to them? If we expect it's okay for you to talk to what, for science, is effectively an imaginary being, why shouldn't we expect some of these individuals to have a two-way dialogue? Why does it have to be a one-way dialogue? So I think it's interesting. The anti-psychiatrist made some really valid points, although, and I warn you, there are some slides coming up of x-rays of what patients will do to themselves now. So if you are likely to be upset by this, then look away. Oh, I beg your pardon. I have actually taken... I think I've self-censored here and taken those out. Okay, yeah, I did. Apologies for that. I was going to suggest, but let me just talk you through rather than showing you what I was going to show you. Thomas Szasz has actually argued that there's no such thing as mental illness, that mental illness is a myth, basically. But then again, patients with severe high-end mental illness will do awful things to themselves. And what I hadn't wanted to do was shock anybody there, not being able to see you and talk you through this, one-to-one. So I decided to take those images out. They were, for example, images that show patients. Well, I'll just give you one description. A patient with schizophrenia who drilled a hole into his skull because he thought that the government had implanted a tracking device overnight in his brain, and then tried with the wire that wraps around a sketching pad, tried to fish out from his brain what he think had actually been, what he thought had been implanted into it. So, the point is that when you get to these high-end psychiatric disorders, trying to turn around and say, this is a social construct, mental illnesses don't really exist, I think is insulting not just to the patient, but to their families. I can assure you, if you went up to a lot of patients' families, a patient with schizophrenia, and said to a family that has been led almost to the point of destruction by their own relatives' behavior, oh, you see, the thing about your relative with schizophrenia, he doesn't really have schizophrenia. It's an imaginary construct. It's a social construct. There's nothing really wrong with them. They'd probably punch you. This is an insult to the patients and their families to tell them that there's nothing really wrong with them, in my opinion. So I think, it's really important to understand that with schizophrenia, there are some very, very significant changes to behavior. Now, we're going to, as I say, finish off with schizophrenia now. And schizophrenic disorders are, as we've already said, a very complex set of disorders characterized by problems with perception, problems with thinking, problems with mood. So there's a lot going on with schizophrenia. It's a spectrum of problems. It's expensive. It costs the UK about 11.8 billion per year, according to London School of Economics figures from a few years ago, which works out at about £76,000 per patient per annum. This is not just the effects of the cost of the drugs, it's also the loss of productivity at work, the loss of taxes that are made by the government So there's all sorts of factors that come into these health economic figures. But the Americans spend approximately $150 billion a year on it, which gives you a flavour of just how expensive this is. It's in our interest then to understand it, not just to help patients with the disorder, but financially for society, it's in our interest to understand it. We've got all sorts of different forms of schizophrenia. Obviously, we have positive symptoms that are described. These are the behaviours that are additional to the norm. The delusions, in other words, false beliefs that we have about ourselves and the world around us. You may have delusions of grandeur. You're somebody very special. You're an emissary of God. You have been given special powers by an alien life force. There are all sorts of delusions that people can experience. The hallucinations which often accompany the delusions are the perceptual experiences that have no basis in reality. You feel things, you hear things. The auditory hallucinations are the most common. You see things. You taste and you smell things that aren't there as well. You'll get auditory hallucinations as common hallucinations, but you'll also get these peculiarities in the way that you smell things that aren't there. It might be the smell of rotting fish or defecation. It could be a whole range of different, rather unpleasant smells usually. They're not typically strawberries and cream or anything nice. And it's interesting here, the cognitive set, the fact that the patients are often feeling quite depressed and low at the same time can shape the nature of the hallucinations, we think, which is perhaps why you have more unpleasant hallucinations than you do pleasant. The auditory hallucinations, for example, may start off pleasant, where you hear a voice talking to you, but often the voice becomes accusatory, it becomes critical, it tells you to do things to yourself or perhaps to other people. It tells you that other people are a threat, that any hallucinations that you have that are attributed to special powers that you've been given, other people want. And you might be in a shop and over the tower you hear, on aisle 4 at the moment, the yellow stickers on the bananas, they've been reduced. And you hear that as, see that guy on aisle 4? He has got special powers. And if you walk past him and touch him, you'll take the special powers away from him. And you can imagine that the patients, in fact, rather than, as the newspapers would have you believe, are likely to become axe-wielding homicidal maniacs, are much more likely to be scared of people. So it's more typically that you'll get social withdrawal with schizophrenia. In other words, the person becomes frightened of other people and withdraws into their own environment. The headline that I was thinking of before, that the Sun had a few years ago, was 1,200 killed by mental patients. I mean, the language is incredible. Yeah, it's the 21st century, not the 1970s. Mental patients. You may as well just call them loonies or mentalists, you know? It's just ludicrous. So I think it's really important to put this in context. You're more likely to be assaulted by a young white male aged 18 to 24 than you are any other person, be it a patient with schizophrenia, be it a patient of an ethnic background. You know, it's so important to get things in perspective. So people with schizophrenia, for the most part, are not going to be axe-wielding homicidal maniacs. There are many different criteria. I'm using the DSM-5 criteria, by the way, because it's dealt with a lot at A-level, I believe. Even though it's the American Psychiatric Association, it's dealt with a lot at A-level in the UK. The ICD criteria that we use over here are not that different. And in fact, with the advent of the new diagnostic system that Europe uses, the ICD-11, due out later on this year, it would be... you're going to have things even more in line between the ICD and the DSM. Okay, it's really important to understand that schizophrenia can be very easily misdiagnosed, and there are all sorts of other conditions that are possible causes of the abnormality in behaviour that you see in the patient. So you can see that schizoid personality disorder, which is similar to schizophrenia but not as significant or severe. Drug abuse, amphetamine users can actually have similar behaviours to people with schizophrenia. Dementia, mood disorders can overlap with the symptoms of schizophrenia. Medications, a whole range of different functions. Temporal lobe epilepsies. Patients with temporal lobe epilepsy can hallucinate and get out-of-body experiences prior to the epileptic seizures manifesting themselves. So all I'm trying to make you realise here is it's not clear-cut, the assessment of schizophrenia, and people can be misdiagnosed. The Royal College of Psychiatrists estimate that 25% of all people with bipolar disorder, that is the swings of mania and depression, are misdiagnosed in the first year. So there's a lot of misdiagnosis that goes on in psychiatry, that's for sure. Okay. The obvious question then is what causes schizophrenia? And we've scratched the surface there. Of course, what we didn't look at were the negative symptoms, which is where behaviours are taken away from you. With the negative symptoms, you have avolition, a lack of motivation. You have anhedonia, a lack of pleasure from things that gave you pleasure. You have affective flattening and emotional vibrancy, where the emotional state remains static rather than vibrant and reactive to your environment. There's all sorts of behaviours that are taken away from you, the negative symptoms. Generally speaking, the positive symptoms, the hallucinations and the delusions, are associated with neurotransmitter changes in the brain and can be responsive to drugs. How responsive? Well, some figures suggest that up to 80% of all cases of schizophrenia will respond at some level, the positive symptoms of schizophrenia will respond at some level to antipsychotic medication. They're the figures you're looking at the moment. So there are people that don't respond to drugs with positive symptoms. There are people with some positive symptoms that respond a little bit, and some people that respond very, very well to the medication. The negative symptoms are more linked to brain pathology. That is, you tend to see, through brain scans and post-mortem studies, changes in the brain in patients who've had this condition for a long time. The dopamine hypothesis is the prevailing hypothesis and has been for many years, that people with schizophrenia have an overactivity of dopamine in the mesocortical pathways, the mesolimbic pathways around the limbic system, just deep in the brain. The positive symptoms, D2 receptors, if those of you listening have covered the different kinds of dopamine receptors, and at the front of the brain, the mesocortical pathway, there is a lack of dopamine. So the problems with thinking, the problems with the ability to engage in rational thought is due to a decreased dopamine within that pathway. Now, we've got evidence, certainly, from published studies that dopamine is linked to this condition. We have observations from brain scanning studies. We have observations of what happens when you give a medication that changes dopamine in the brain to a patient with schizophrenia. The behavior will often decrease in severity. So we know that dopamine is involved. It's just that dopamine alone, we think, is insufficient to explain the complexity of schizophrenia. The idea that this complex disorder might be attributable to just one neurotransmitter is not really something that we would actually concur with today. In fact, as Karl Popper, the famous philosopher of science, writes, whenever a theory appears to you as the only possible one, take this as a sign that you've neither understood the theory nor the problem that it was intended to solve. I think that gives you an idea of